The question today is, does marriage matter? Well, you could argue that in many ways, marriage matters more today than ever. And so says the book, I Do.
A clear path forward requires looking back and learning. Good public policy requires human connection. It's a consideration of the facts, applying common sense, and innovation. It's urban, it's rural, it's real life. We all have something to contribute. We all have a responsibility to get informed because there's a little piece of Canada in all of us, isn't there? Let's learn on this path together. This is Leaders on the Frontier.
So with me here today is one of the authors of the book, I Do, Why Marriage Still Matters, is Peter Jon Mitchell. So a warm welcome to you, Peter Jon.
Oh, yeah. Thanks for having me on.
Well, it's delightful to see you. You're with the incredible think tank Cardis, and you are certainly one of the leaders there. And I want to congratulate you on this fine book. I very much appreciated it. I thought it was a very thoughtful, incisive way to look at understanding marriage in a new way. And I think you eloquently invite all of us to think about its strategic significance, not just simply for our own personal lives, for those of us who are married, but for all of society. And so I thought it was a brilliant book. And I guess the question I have is, why did you decide to write this with your fellow author, Andrea Mrozik?
Well, thanks, David. Yeah, it's certainly no secret that marriage has been on the decline here in Canada and in North America for many decades. And so the question is, does that really matter? Does marriage, is it something more than just a private relationship, a personal choice, or is there something greater there? Is it an important part of society and something that is necessary for strong, prosperous societies? And so in the book, it's a concise invitation for people to reconsider the logic of marriage that might be missing today, and also engage in the language of marriage as well. And that's really what compelled us to write this concise book.
And I like the way you state that. It's almost like rediscovering what is marriage really all about, the logic, if you will, the rationale. And you use a lot of statistics. It's you've done a lot of research here. And you also dare to look at the public policy issues that are associated with this. Because, anyways, one of the things that really struck me was this famous quote by a Nobel laureate economist, James Heckman, I believe it was. And Heckman says, nobody wants to talk about the family, and the family's the whole story. And it's the whole story about a lot of social and economic issues. What do you think Heckman meant by that? That's quite a quote.
Yeah, Heckman is a very knowledgeable economist and is known for a lot of the work that he's done on early childhood education, but he's not so much known for this quote and really some of the work that he's doing more lately, which is really looking at the family and how understudied the impact of family of origin can be. And certainly we can see across many disciplines that a strong, stable family gives kids a great start. And marriage is part of that, in part because marriage remains the most stable family form that we have. And so that advantage we've seen in the social sciences, we've seen in economics as well. The kids that have that two-parent advantage, as some have said, tend to have higher attainment and education, tend to be less prone to certain risk behaviors. And of course, we're talking in the aggregate, we're talking in the large statistical sense, but we certainly do see in the data that there is some advantages to growing up in a married parent family.
Indeed. So I like the way you're summarizing the issue here, that it behooves us, if we care about many things, including children and larger society, that we look at marriage. So help us understand, Peter Jon, the state of marriage in Canada today. What would be the high-level stats that you put in the book regarding, how is marriage doing in Canada today?
Yeah, so certainly we've seen a decline in marriage over the last number of decades. So even if we look at census data and we look at what Statistics Canada calls a census family, so that would be couple families, lone parent families, um, both married, I should say, both married and unmarried families, we've seen the portion of those families that are married decline from in sort of in the 80% range down to
Hmm.
64%, and probably since 1981. So certainly seeing a decline in the portion of married families, seeing an increase in families that are living together outside of marriage, or couples living outside of marriage, and an increase in lone parent families as well. And one of the things that we're interested in is what do people think about marriage? And so we've looked at the public opinion data that's available over the last decade or so. And I think if I were to sum that up, the sentiment is really marriage is nice, but it's unnecessary. I think people still generally remain fairly positive about marriage
Hmm.
as a choice, but really just see it as one of many options. And part of that, I think, David, is because we see it as such a privatized relationship and
Mm.
really think about what are the personal benefits that I want to derive out of this relationship, and is marriage going to give me those benefits, and which is certainly important, but marriage is a bit more than that as well.
Hmm. So I thought a very intriguing part of the book that helped me understand kind of the main central theme of the book, as you talked about marriage as an institution that is very important to understand, is that in this kind of hyper individualistic culture we have, where we often ask, well, what's in it for me? What are my needs? You kind of gave the almost humorous stereotype of how we see often marriage in romantic, simplistic lenses, like almost like a Walt Disney movie, where it's kind of like some think that marriage is all about, well, you complete me, you're like my soulmate, and it's all about kind of romance and rainbows versus the institution. Can you help us explain the difference between these two almost insights around marriage?
Yeah, so that you complete me sense of marriage that I think was highlighted in Jerry Maguire. At least that's the movie that I think about.
That's right.
Thinking of
In Jerry Maguire's movie.
yeah, that's right. Uh, uh, we borrow the term from sociologists, soulmate marriage. So this is the kind of relationship that's framed around sort of the privatized relationship around what does this do for me in terms of self actualization, in terms
Hmm.
of developing myself, puts quite a bit of emphasis on what the partner can do for me.
Hmm.
And as a result, I think we see this as a less stable view of marriage because if it's
Hmm.
not working for me, then I can jet out of this and find something that makes me happier or more fulfilled. And we compare that with the institutional model, which I guess in movie terms would be more like a Lord of the Rings type of venture with ups and downs of the long game. I think that's the way we would picture it. And really, institutions and social institutions combine things like norms and rules, expectations, um, things that are required of us. And when we enter a social institution, we are uh, agreeing to limit certain behaviors for the good of the whole. And there's a sociologist in the United States, Brad Wilcox, who's also just written a book about a year ago that's
Hmm.
very good, where he describes institutional marriage as really this combination of economic cooperation, intimacy, sexual relationship, parenting, all together in a permanent relationship. And those are the two models that we kind of contrast and compare in the book. And I would say that we, as a culture, lean more towards the soulmate model of marriage, and
Hmm.
we're suggesting that that needs to be balanced out with a more institutional understanding of marriage.
Okay, so yeah, it's just I thought a brilliant insight is let's move beyond kind of the superficial, almost childlike vision of love to one that is endearing and one of long-term commitment until, well, till our teeth fall out or even beyond that. So anyways, I thought that was a kind of a seminal understanding. And so you're obviously promoting the significant benefits and strategic importance of that institutional perspective on marriage. That's really what you're promoting here. Is that right?
Yeah, so we do talk about in the book about why marriage is still relevant today. Why in today's culture, in today's Canada, why do we still need marriage? So we talk a bit about why we would still have marriage, and certainly around the framework of building a family and starting a family and
Mhm.
committing parents to their kids and ensuring that moms and dads are connected and involved in the lives of their kids. And one of the things we do in the book is we do look at the benefits from social science that we see um, in for men, for women, and for children, and for communities as well. So we touch on something that sociologists call the marriage advantage, and that's
Mhm.
the outcomes that we see that are associated with marriage. And there's probably two possible reasons why we might see these or two theories about why we might see some of these outcomes. So some people would suggest, well, this is a selection effect, that people who perhaps get married are the same people that are more likely to, acquire higher levels of education, that
Mhm.
sort of thing. And the other thesis is the protective effect, that actually by marrying, that this is protective or that it's motivation. So, for example, we know in the data that married men uh, tend to do a little bit better economically,
Mhm.
despite their education level. And so this might be a motivating factor that now you have a family to care for. This might actually motivate some of your behavior. So which one is right? Is it protective, or is it selective? And the answer is probably it's a bit of both, depending
Mhm.
too on the variable that you're looking at. But certainly in the book we lay out what some of those advantages are for married couples and for the kids
Hmm.
that they raise.
That's interesting. So your research shows that as men and women alike get up to that kind of public commitment, whether it's within a religious institution or any other setting, and they declare that kind of lifelong commitment to each other in the tradition of marriage, um, it has big impacts, great advantages, and we'll go through them in a moment. But it kind of, in the case of men, would you say it matures them, gets them to help them to grow up, so to speak?
I think that's right. I remember reading a paper a few years ago and reading a GM of an NHL team talking about the potential he thought that a particular player in the team would have in the coming season because this player got married over the summer. And I think his hockey sense was picking up on something that economists have noticed and have picked up on, and that's that married men tend to be more productive. And there is that sort of aspect of settling down, perhaps
Mhm.
that you're talking about. And I think if we look out throughout history, young, unattached men in large groups is a problem for civilizations, and
Indeed,
so to
yes.
some degree, marriage does quote unquote civilize men. Now, that doesn't mean that that's the role of women, that they're supposed to civilize men or anything like that, but there is
Mhm.
something about um, engaging in that relationship and then it sort of shaping behavior. And it was a now retired sociologist in the U.S., David Popenow, that said there's very few institutions that actually shape men towards productivity outside of perhaps organized religion and the military. It's
Mhm.
marriage, and it does, and we've seen that. And it's interesting that we have seen decline, or perhaps I can put it this way, we've seen an increase of able bodied young men who are not attached to the workforce over the last number of decades. And that has coincided with this decline in marriage. And some work in the
Mhm.
US by economist Nicholas Eberstadt has shown that men, even with lower levels of education but are married, tend to be attached to the workforce more consistently than men of the same skill level that are unmarried. And
Hmm.
in fact, they may even be more attached to the workforce than men who are unmarried but have slightly more skill attainment
Mhm.
than they have. So there's definitely a connection there for men. We see it
Okay.
in production. Certainly, economic production is one of those measures. But there is something about that is forming and shaping, and that's what social institutions do. They do shape our behavior, and they do
Mhm.
form us.
Exactly. So, gosh, there's a lot of really interesting angles there, as you outlined in your book, actually, is that these institutions have formed over millennia because, well, they work and they bring people together to create a benefit, not only for the individuals involved, but for the common good. Is that kind of what we mean then by the marriage institution?
Yeah, for sure. And as you say, this has been, we arrive at these social institutions over time because they've been taught, tried, and tested. And we have determined that this is a good way to organize society and to live. And
Yeah,
that doesn't mean that social institutions don't shift and change over
sure.
time. They do, of course. But I think in our current context, marriage becomes a bit rote. It becomes something
Hmm.
that's we've always done, and we've lost a little bit of that logic side of it,
Hmm.
which is what we're trying to recapture in our book here, is
Exactly.
to really talk
So,
about that.
we look at these things often from a public policy lens. So it behooves us to step back and strategically say, how does the brilliant world of civil society generate these institutions, these ways of behaving together and working together as a kind of a team to build a better society? And I guess what struck me about your book is that one of the major advantages of this type of stable marriage relationship is that it's a brilliant place, in most cases, not all, because we're all imperfect, to nurture children. So, how important is that in the larger scheme of things?
Yeah, I think that's an essential purpose of why marriage was formed in the first place, is to ensure that mom and dad are there together, raising kids, and it does keep parents in the picture, and it does create that stability that's good for kids. That's not to say that great kids don't grow up in other family forms. And my example is always Barack Obama, who obviously ascended to the president of the United States and grew up in a lone parent family. So there's always exceptions, but we
Hmm.
do know that in general, a healthy marriage does give these advantages to children, and ensures that there's some content there. We've seen that in our own studies at Cardis, even in our education study, we've seen the impact of family background in terms of outcomes, not just in terms of academics, but even in terms of like involvement in volunteering and things like that as well. So
Hmm.
there's some long-term sort of gains for that stability. And marriage really is organized around, it is really a child-centered institution at the end
Hmm.
of the day.
Indeed. So, let's talk a little bit about the marriage advantage, as you call it. Tell us about health. Are there health benefits of being married?
Yeah, I think this is really fascinating because we've seen actually quite a bit of data over the last number of decades correlating with marriage. So, in one sense, it is a protective effect. So we do see married people tend to be diagnosed a little bit quicker. I wonder if it's, I know sometimes in my own relationship, my wife prods me to get to the doctor. And sometimes it's just a sense of like somebody's looking out, somebody's noticing, somebody's watching, observing, and helping connect with care. But we also know that there's increased, faster and better recovery generally for married folks compared to folks that are divorced or unmarried. And again, that might be, excuse me, that supportive relationship. And we've certainly seen there's a program here in Ottawa that actually kind of explored, how a supportive partner can help increase recovery from heart surgery and that sort of thing. So these
Hmm.
things have been well documented, and we do list that in the book. Many of the studies, the empirical studies that have looked at the connection between healthy outcome, and certainly there's some mental health aspects with marriage as well. And generally, men and women who are married generally tend to be happier on scales of measures
Hmm.
of happiness as well. Of course, this is correlates with healthy marriage. Unhealthy marriages can certainly be detrimental, but we're talking about when about healthy marriages.
Yeah, no, it's really quite stunning, the data that you table in the book. The other benefit that you emphasize is economic. Can you tell us more about that?
Yeah, it's very interesting looking at the economic data with married parents or married families, particularly when we look at it in contrast with cohabiting families. Some of the data has shown that married couples are more likely to sort of combine their incomes and then be able to use the combined income, leverage that income towards greater savings, um, sort of greater kind of planning that way. And so we do see the likelihood of greater net worth among uh, married families compared to cohabiting. And also, we do know that cohabiting before marriage and serial cohabitation does affect things like net worth and overall savings as well. So
Mhm.
for those who've cohabited more frequently before entering a marriage, are generally have lower net worth, according to the
Mhm.
studies. So there are some economic advantages there as well. And I thought, in addition to what I mentioned before about just associations and connections to the labor force with married men.
Mhm. So, one of the things that I found very interesting, that was a bit of a revelation for me within the book, was that marriage is pretty popular statistically among middle and upper class persons on the socioeconomic scale, but not as popular on the lower end of the scale. Can you help us understand what's going on there?
Yeah, so as I said before, marriage has been declining over decades, but that decline has not been even across income levels or education levels. And so we've seen this in North America. We've seen studies in the UK as well that people with higher levels of educational attainment are more likely to be married and stay married, and we're seeing that less so among people with lower educational attainment or lower income. And certainly, then lower income folks are not accessing the benefits necessarily that their peers with higher levels of educational attainment are. And there's probably a number of reasons why this could happen, but one of them is really again goes back to our understanding of marriage and how we practice marriage.
Mhm.
So for my generation and those maybe a little bit younger than myself, we really come to see marriage as something that you step into once you've attained all the other sort of things, all the other goals in life. So increasingly, people are wanting to they're wanting to get their career started. They want to feel financially
Mm.
stable. They want
Mhm.
to feel ready as a person to enter marriage. In fact, uh, I think there's nobody really tries to understand what young adults are thinking about marriage more than the people that are trying to sell them diamond rings. And there's a very interesting diamond commercial that came out this fall that was all about that sense of I want to be the best version of myself before I find a partner and marry. I got to work on myself. And um, that is a very different kind of way of thinking about marriage than, say, perhaps my parents' generation, who married much younger, um, but saw it as a foundation of building a life together, get married,
Mhm.
start those careers, maybe eventually find a home, have kids, that sort of thing. So it's a difference between a foundational model of marriage and a capstone model of marriage. So if we sort of subscribe to the capstone model of marriage, that's going to work for folks that can attain those until
Oh,
they're
okay.
getting to life later. But
Yeah.
for I think those for whom marriage just seems out of reach, and I think that's partly at play. Certainly, there's probably economic reasons that are at play as well. In our economy, with the price of housing and those sorts of things, people don't feel they can attain the kinds of
Mhm.
things that they think they need for a lifelong commitment like marriage.
Okay.
So I think those are some of the factors that are at play, but it does have implications for the benefits and who gets to enjoy those benefits that come that marriage advantage.
Mhm.
Certainly, we should be concerned about.
Well, it was really quite interesting the way you outline these different variables, and they all kind of work together to create this complicated pattern that all kind of undermine marriage. Um, like you even talk about the dating scene, and I think you alluded to that before, where if women have a certain standard, they may see the men that are available to marry as not being suitable. And then if you have an economy that's struggling, where people find it hard to get a job and to advance and go forward, let alone buying a home because of affordability issues, because of bad economic policies, then you can see it becomes kind of a train wreck. No wonder people are not getting married as often. Is that kind of the point that you're making?
I certainly think that's part of it for sure. And obviously, society has changed, and particularly as we've seen over the decades, women are able to access post-secondary education and enter the workforce increasingly. Perhaps the need for being supported by men is no longer the case. That said, when we look at survey data women still generally want something
Hmm.
that's productive, right? They find the survey data would tell us that that's an attractive quality in a mate. So I think this does still very much matter. The ability to be economically productive. It's not, certainly not the only thing, but it does definitely play
Hmm.
into our understanding of what's happening in the dating culture. And of course, we're getting to marriage later. The average age of first marriage is somewhere around 30 or somewhere about in there. And, probably in the 70s it was around 23, 24. So
Wow, what a
there's been a
difference.
steep increase. And it's been climbing pretty steadily year after year. So,
Yeah.
and that's again just again, part of that's economic. Part of it is that the markers for adulthood that we traditionally think about, young adults are arriving to at later
Mhm.
ages, and not necessarily in the order that previous generations did. And as we spend longer in school, rack up debt, again, cost of housing,
Mhm.
things like that. These all are all kind of factors that are in part play into delayed marriage, and
Mhm.
maybe some of the challenges we're seeing, perhaps in the dating scene as well.
No, I think those are really good points. So let's talk about women as an example. I recall talking with friends who were feminists that were adamant that, well, marriage is kind of, it's slavery for women. And I think you respond to that in the book. Can you share us the insight on that? Because that was kind of from another era, wasn't it? Where marriage wasn't necessarily always that great for women.
Yeah, so I think when we reflect in the book on the role of maybe feminism and its sort of thinking on marriage, definitely there are feminisms. There are different feminisms, and but I think the ascendant feminism of perhaps the sexual revolution in the '60s, and
Hmm.
so maybe before then, I think we could even go back to some of the in the '40s. There's this idea that marriage was a trap for women, if not just very destructive, and that's not I mean, it was based on some real concerns about how marriage functions and bad marriages had functioned. But I think what we're seeing among, uh, I think we're seeing like a renewed interest in marriage. I think of feminists like Louise Perry or Mary Harrington, um, Christine Emba in the U.S. as well has written on this. So I'm taking a second look at marriage and saying, actually, we think that marriage could be very good for women, and in part because I think in this the fruit of the sexual revolution has been um, somewhat poor for kids and for adults as well. And I think, as Louise Perry says, I think in sexual relationships, women take a greater portion of the risk than men. And I think
Mm-hmm.
marriage and that connection of sex to marriage, which seems perhaps like outdated, I think
Hmm.
we've seen in the sexual revolution that maybe that requires some rethinking. That maybe
Hmm.
there's some protective effect there for marriage. So well, I'm certainly there are some pretty significant statements made by feminists in the past, based on things that maybe they observed. I do think that among some feminists that's changing. There's a re-engagement,
Hmm.
and of course, if we were to go back much to first wave feminists or whatever, there was certainly maybe a different view of marriage and cooperation even before the industrial revolution, when the family was the economic sort of unit of production, right? Where without the men and women working in partnership, you're not going to survive the winter. That's a whole different
Yeah,
a whole different
exactly.
understanding of marriage, right? And so we could go even that far to that as well. But,
Very good. So, yeah, marriage has its natural trade-offs, and that's part of being adults is making those decisions around how we're going to work together as a team. And that takes a lot of maturity, doesn't it? So, speaking of maturity, one of the realities that marriages face is the issue of divorce. And I found it interesting. Help us understand, what are the real stats? How many people are actually getting divorced in this country? Is it really that high of 50%?
yeah, so we hear the 50% divorce rate all the time, and I think there was a time in the U.S. when that was more likely to be the case. And in our book, we try to present both U.S. and Canadian data. It's certainly not the case now in Canada. When we think about that 50% number, it's really more like 34% in 2019. I think is the number. 34% of all marriages would end in divorce. So that's quite different than what we're told. And in fact, we've actually seen the divorce rate go down over the
Go
last couple of
down.
years. So
Wow, that's so
now,
that's good news.
so it is good news, but it's kind of we kind of think of it as two out of three hurrahs or cheers, in part because one of the reasons that it's going down is that fewer people are getting married. So that does affect things like divorce rates when fewer
Mhm.
people are marrying. But in general, I think that's a good thing, that our marriages are more durable. And partly that's because we're marrying at later ages, and so that cohort of married folks are a little bit older, which may contribute to less divorce. Um, so there's a number of factors at play, but yes, that 50% number is a myth for Canada, and I'm happy to kill that myth because I
Mhm.
think it's important people understand the stability of marriage.
Okay, well, that's good news. So, speaking of divorce, I certainly read a lot of research regarding the implementation so many years ago, is almost like a trend over decades, of so called no fault divorce systems. And it's fascinating that you talk about that in the book and how it sounds like we made a kind of a strategic error by adopting that system because now it's so easy to divorce. I mean, you could wake up tomorrow and it's nobody's fault. You just say and declare, well, my marriage is over, and then it's done. So, did we goof on that one?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. So I would just preface by saying that divorce is a reality, and certain marriages, some marriages can do nothing but end a divorce.
Hmm.
Sometimes it is the safest option for people involved. I just want to clarify and kind of set I guess the table by saying that. But it is interesting. The move towards unilateral divorce or no fault divorce was partly motivated by the fact that divorce is so acrimonious, and particularly in the fault system. So it was thought that
Hmm.
this would reduce kind of conflict and would make divorce less damaging. I
Hmm.
think what we found, though, is this was part of the divorce revolution that really happened in the 70s and 80s as these policies came in. In Canada, it was in 1968, and then we had another change of the Divorce Act in 1985. And we do see spikes in divorce around those legislative changes. But yes, and certainly with removing fault from divorce, what it didn't prevent is people leaving marriages more easily, and perhaps leaving marriages that
Hmm.
might be salvageable. And so certainly there are lots of examples of divorces happening where one partner would have actually contested divorce. They would not want to get divorced, but under the law can do little to prevent it. And I think too, nobody gets married thinking they're going to get divorced or hoping they get divorced. Right? It does represent a breakdown in a relationship, and so um, I think there's always going to be sort of that negative aspect there, and particularly when children are involved, that relationship is never really severed because you have this link with your children, right? And so we certainly do look at the stats. We do definitely see that it made divorce much easier to get, and certainly that was part of the divorce revolution and the increase in divorce rates. And one of the things that we've seen a little bit of data on, interestingly, is that if you experience divorce within your social circle, it does kind of increase the possibility or probability that you yourself will get divorced. And it's sort of this idea that a possibility of like a divorce contagion.
Oh my.
I think that data is interesting to think about and look at,
Hmm.
but certainly I think from a culture perspective, making divorce easier does sort of make
Hmm.
marriage less permanent for everyone. It's always that
Yeah.
possibility. But
Well, divorce certainly has a huge impact on everybody, particularly children. But what I find also interesting is in the area of family law. I mean, obviously, there's a lot of controversy, but I hear this so often, anecdotally from men in particular, that there's no point, there's no rational reason to get married under current marriage law because in a divorce situation, you potentially lose everything, including your children. Does that come up in the research? Because I think rationally, there's really no reason why a male would get married. I mean, it's a sad kind of reality. Is that a fair comment?
I think, yeah, family law is very complicated and full of very sad stories for sure. And um, I do think that with making divorce easier, obviously we see increasing divorce, and um, we do experience these kind of stories. The one thing that we do kind of caution about in the book, and I think this is in doing family policy for nearly 2 decades, this is something that I try to keep first and foremost when I'm thinking about this, is that it's really difficult to talk about something like marriage or family policy without looking through the lens of our own experience. And there
Hmm.
is value in our own experience, but it's not the whole story. And I think that's why it's helpful to look at some of the data as well. And we just have to kind of acknowledge, yeah, our own experiences do color how we think about these issues,
Hmm.
and acknowledge it. And then I'm hoping readers are able to hold that in one hand and kind of look at the evidence and data in the other.
Indeed.
It is unfortunate that I think there's a lot of challenges within the family law systems, right? And they're very complicated and often can
Hmm.
be kind of destructive. And yes, that's obviously going to affect how people think about marriage and their willingness to enter a marriage, right?
But is there research that would suggest that family law tends to be biased in favor of the female parent versus the male parent? Is there, because I mean, I think it's kind of common knowledge, or at least it seems to be, that men perceive family law as biased against them. So hence, rationally, why would you get married if you go into the possibility that sadly there could be a divorce and you stand to lose much of everything?
So I am familiar that there are some Canadian scholars that have looked into that. I'm not as familiar with that research of that system. Certainly, we read the stories. I'm probably not an expert on how family law is being adjudicated. Um, there was, there certainly was move towards like 50-50 split, and that's been with children, that kind of thing, and that's been a matter of debate as well. But I'm just not as familiar with
Okay,
research on
all
that.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I was just thinking about, I believe a couple years ago there was an effort by actually MPs, I think it was within the Harper government, to introduce a private members bill that the default was co parenting, which seemed to make a lot of sense on the assumption that only if the children would be in a tenuous or difficult situation that it would be otherwise. But that was not successfully passed. So it almost seems like the default is towards the female parent, which seems like a shame. Um, Regardless, the point that you have made brilliantly in the book is that we seem to fundamentally misunderstand and really undervalue the strategic benefits of marriage. And so, one of the points I thought you made incisively is it's not just about setting the stage for dealing with improving economic opportunities for everybody involved in marriage, including society, but dealing with social poverty. What did you mean by that?
Yeah, I think sometimes we see the decline in marriage um, most painfully in some of the difficult social issues that we see. A few weeks ago, I was talking with someone who is involved in working with the underhoused and the homeless, and really, I think a large portion of that population would have, to their estimate, not grown up in a stable family, and where family of origin would have been quite chaotic, and certainly that's not the only contributing factor, but it is a factor. And I feel in Canada, my experience has been in doing family policy over the last nearly 2 decades, that this is something that we're quite reluctant to talk about, the relationship between family structure and some of the risks and challenges that we're facing. I think we see this more in the U.S. There seems to be more debate, more discussion, even across the aisle, about the role of family structure, and what to do about it is I think, the big debate. But at least it's acknowledged. But in the book, we do kind of touch on the absence of stable families and its role in some of these difficult challenges that we're seeing on our streets. My co-author Andrea talks about our own experience working with families
Hmm.
in need, and seeing that story play out again and again.
Hmm. Well, I thought it was a very powerful point, is that the health of marriage has a huge impact as it relates to children and their ability to be happy, healthy, well-adjusted adults. So we've got to connect these dots. And it seems to me that it begs the question then, what is the role of the state here in terms of public policy, keeping in mind that part of the genius of marriage is that it's a civil institution. It's part of the wonderful tradition and values of society over a long, long time. So you don't want the state so-called meddling, but maybe it's one of, how do you say, one of empowerment, one of encouragement to say, how do we put in place good decisions and policy that encourage marriage to thrive? So I guess my question is, what is the role of the state, and what are the examples, Peter, John, of what we should be doing in this country?
Yeah, I would certainly approach the question much as you've stated it, and that as a social institution, I think much of the recovery of a healthy marriage culture is cultural work, not the work of the state. But the state has an interest in healthy, functioning families, and so there is a role that it plays. So my first rule would be do no harm, and really we can see that I think some of the unintended ways that marriage is discouraged, particularly through distribution of benefits. So for folks that are receiving some sort of benefit, let's say disability benefit in particular, getting married might mean a clawback of that benefit that's significant. So I actually know a couple who delayed getting married for almost a decade because the clawback on a benefit was going to be so severe. And so we need to be really looking for these marriage policies or penalties in when we're legislating, and really thinking about policies that don't unintentionally disadvantage people that would want to move into marriage. That's certainly a lot of debate. I think too we need to both culturally and perhaps I think there's room for the state to talk about marriage as a positive social institution. Really, I really I scratch my head to think of a sexual health education program, across the country that it deals with marriage. We certainly made an appeal in Ontario a few years ago to include marriage in the sexual health curriculum when it was being reviewed. Young adults want a partner, and most of them want to have a lifelong relationship like marriage, but there's really no instruction about how to get there from here. And I think in sort of that kind of educational model, there might be room to talk about the benefits of marriage.
I think that's a great example. I have a confession to make, Peter, John. I have said this for years. When I was growing up, I sound like an elder here, but when I was growing up, I took these courses in gym, of course, about human sexuality, and it was like an engineering course. And I know the teachers meant well; they were really nice people, but we never talked about the concept of relationship, let alone marriage. And it seemed like a missed opportunity to talk about the context of human sexuality. It's almost like we totally missed the plot. And so is that what you're getting at, is that we need to kind of have a holistic take on sexuality within marriage as well?
Yeah, I think so. And again, from the survey data that we've seen, young adults and young people are looking towards future relationships, and certainly I think this is something that we can be talking about in that kind of curriculum. And ultimately, the state does have some interest in things like fertility rates, which in Canada is quite low. I think we're now at 2.1 births per woman, which is the total fertility rate, which is the measure. And for context, for a population to basically self-reproduce would be 2.1, and we're at 1.2. So that's quite
okay. So let's be clear here. So when we talk about fertility rates, this is of vital interest to all of us if we think of a healthy society. Now, I do have a caveat later. I'll get to that in a moment. But the fertility rate for a healthy society, if we want to replace each other, is 2.1 for births. And the fertility rate now in Canada is 1.22. Is that correct?
Yeah.
So we're way below the replacement rate. Now, my caveat is that some people, and this gets into the ideological divide, say, well, that's great. The problem is, and they're so-called Malthusians, people who think the problem of the world is we've got too many people. Maybe we should just manage a population decline. Is that a reasonable option in your perspective, Peter John?
I think it's unreasonable for a couple of reasons. One, I think for productivity of the country, we do need people for that. I think for innovation, we do
Hmm.
need people, and I think babies are great. That's another reason why I think we should be having babies. But we also know from our own work here and surveying data here at Cardis that about half of Canadian women are having fewer children than they say they want to have, and so
Hmm.
there is something about personal happiness to this question as well, and
Hmm.
for people to achieve the number of children that they say that they want. And I think that's reason enough probably to be concerned about this.
Hmm.
But certainly there are certainly concerns economically for a country to be able to maintain its social programs, particularly because we're an aging society. So certainly
Hmm.
we'll have an aging generation that will be needing more benefits from healthcare to retirement to those sorts of things. So we definitely do that. And of course, in Canada, we rely quite heavily on immigration to kind of make up for the fact that we have such low fertility.
Hmm.
But this is something, and again, that I think like this is something that governments have to think carefully about in terms of pronatalist policies. It can be certainly done very poorly and for the wrong reason.
Hmm.
But I think, as our data has shown, when people are not having the kids they say that they want, that's something that we're worth, I think, talking about and thinking about. And I just don't actually see that conversation happening at the policymaker level in Canada.
Okay.
Um,
So what do you mean by that? The conversation isn't occurring where they're connecting the dot between marriage formulation and marriage encouragement, shall we say, and the whole issue of fertility?
I don't think Canadian policymakers are really talking about fertility in the way that I think we should be, in general, just acknowledging that this is a potential crisis and an important issue. I've
Okay.
seen more talk of it. I'm likely to see something in the Global Mail or whatever more recently on that, but I don't think at the policy level we've talked about that.
Hmm.
It remains true that most children in Canada are born into married parent families. So I think if we continue to see declines in marriage, that is going to be correlated with declines in fertility as well. As probably that correlation is probably already there.
Hmm.
So this connecting the dots between fertility and marriage again is something that I think is worth discussing and debating um, and considering from a public policy um, uh, perspective. And of course, as I said before, I think most of the work on reestablishing a healthy marriage culture is cultural work, I think.
Hmm.
But again, I do think the state has some interest in this.
Okay. Well, there's so many case studies. I had the privilege of being able to go to Italy last year with a family excursion. It was fascinating because in talking with a variety of people there, it's clear that it is existential time for Italy, among other countries. I think of Korea at a birth rate of 0.88, as I recall. And these nations are on a downward spiral. I mean, there's even hundreds of thousands of homes now that are being abandoned because it's a time of depopulation. And no amount of immigration is well, theoretically, no practical amount of immigration is going to solve that issue. So Canada is not that far behind. So this sounds like an urgent matter. Are there solutions that you recommend to this fertility issue that you would highlight then, Peter John?
Yeah, so I think I certainly think that we could be having a greater public conversation about how we support families and what families need. Um, and whether that's financial supports or whether that's addressing our housing issue. I think housing would be a big anything that we could do to help with affordability would probably contribute in some way. We need to be honest, though, that it is possible to tease up fertility rates, but it requires a lot of money and it's hard to sustain. So you kind of get a little bit of bump
Hmm.
in return for spending a lot of cash, right? And so you kind of have to think through some of those issues. And that, again, that's where I think like there's some cultural work to be done on the fertility issue as well.
Okay.
And it's not just affordability. When we look at our survey data, again, some of the things that affect marriage, like wanting to establish oneself, wanting to have opportunities to travel or to self-actualization, self-betterment, often comes into conflict with the thought of starting a family. And it's not, it's kind of funny because these things are not necessarily um, in competition with one another. You can travel with kids; it's a little harder, a little more expensive. That can be done, but there is sort of this sense that things need to be kind of squared away and perfected in my own life first, and then I can look at family formation and that kind of thing. Again, I think it's
Mhm.
very much the capstone view of family life, and again, there are. It leaves those who don't feel that they can attain that sort of on the outside.
Okay. So you've mentioned earlier, and you allude to this in the book many, many times, is that it's difficult to talk about the issue of marriage and associated policy issues in Canada in particular. And I'm wondering, why is that?
It's a good question and one that I've wondered about many times, particularly in comparison to the U.S., where we'll see
Hmm.
talk about marriage and social policy implications from American Enterprise Institute, which tends to be center right, and we'll see the same conversation, actually cross conversations at Brookings Institution, which may be more center left, we'll say, or certainly scholars that might be more center left there. So it's very interesting that this conversation happens in the U.S., but it doesn't happen in Canada.
Hmm.
And part of it, I wonder if it comes down to we're so polite that we don't want to offend. We don't want to talk about family structure because we don't want to be judgmental. And I certainly understand that. I don't want to be
Hmm.
judging
Yeah.
people either. But I think we're doing a disservice if we don't acknowledge the clear um, data on what happens when family structure is unstable and its contribution to some of the challenges. I don't think that's fair to people if we're
Hmm.
not giving them the goods. And I mean, our book at the end there, we do talk about we got to give the goods to particularly to young adults. I think they can handle it. So I think there's ways to do that that is respectful and acknowledges that again we're talking about real people and their lives, their situations. But I think we do a disservice by not talking about it in Canada.
Mhm. I agree with you that we do a disservice not only by not talking about it, but clearly stating the benefits of the data that show that marriage has got a distinct advantage, not only for the people involved, generally speaking, but also for society. And so that's what your book does. So bravo on you. In the meantime, I just think it's terrific the way you've outlined the case for marriage. And so thank you very much, Peter Jon Mitchell, for joining us today for this far reaching conversation about why marriage matters.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for watching Leaders on the Frontier. We're a nonpartisan think tank. We explore ideas, policy, and practical solutions that can make a difference in the lives of Canadians. We do not accept any government funding. We work for you. Thank you for supporting Frontier. Visit fcpp.org to give. While you're there, be sure to check out our latest articles and research. Without open discussion and debate, you're not thinking, nor are you free. Comment below. We'd love for you to join the conversation.